January 14th, 1979. Queens, New York. A man steps out of his house into the cold. He's 28 years old, built like a linebacker, hands like cinder blocks. He spent his entire life fighting, stealing, and killing to reach this moment. Tonight, the Lucchese crime family is going to make him one of their own. He's going to take the oath. He's going to prick his finger, hold the burning saint card, and swear his life to La Cosa Nostra. He's going to become untouchable. He climbs into a car with two men he's known for years. He never comes home. His body is never found. His name was Tommy DeSimone, and the ceremony he was driving to, it didn't exist. 9 years earlier, three men beat a Gambino-made man named Billy Batts to death in a Queens bar. Tommy DeSimone, Jimmy Burke, Henry Hill. They buried the body in a field near the Connecticut border. They thought they'd gotten away with it. They hadn't. In 1979, the bill came due. But here's the part that doesn't make sense. Only Tommy paid. Jimmy Burke died in prison decades later, of natural causes. Henry Hill lived to 69, sold his story to Hollywood, and became the most famous rat in mafia history. The mob knew where both men were. They never touched them. So here's the question. Why did the mafia execute Tommy DeSimone and let the other two walk? What you're about to hear isn't a story about revenge. It's a story about survival. Because the mafia doesn't kill the men who break the rules. It kills the men it can't afford to keep alive. Most killers are made. Something breaks them. A beating they couldn't survive without going numb. A father who taught them pain was the only language worth speaking. A moment where the world showed its teeth and they decided to show theirs back. There's usually a story, a reason, an origin you can point to and say, that's where the human ended and the thing that replaced it began. Or Tommy DeSimone didn't have that story, or if he did, nobody who knew it lived long enough to tell it. He was born on May 24th, 1950, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a fact that surprises people because they expect a man like Tommy to have crawled out of some tenement in Bensonhurst with blood already under his fingernails. But Cambridge is where the DeSimone family happened to be when Tommy arrived. And the family's roots ran through organized crime the way other families' roots ran through farming or the church. Tommy's grandfather, Rosario DeSimone, had been a boss in the Los Angeles Mafia. Not a soldier, not an associate, a boss. His uncle was connected to the Gambino family in New York. Crime wasn't something Tommy's family fell into. It was the family business, and Tommy was the heir. By the time the DeSimones relocated to Brooklyn, the boy was already absorbing the culture like oxygen. He watched the men in the neighborhood, the way they walked, the way other people moved aside for them, the way a room changed when they entered it. He understood, even as a child, that power in his world didn't come from money or education. It came from the willingness to do what other men wouldn't. And Tommy was willing. At 13, he was running errands for local criminals, picking up envelopes, delivering messages. He's standing lookout while older boys handled business he wasn't yet old enough to understand. At 14, he'd already been in more fights than most men see in a lifetime. He didn't fight like a kid. He fought like something that hadn't been taught where to stop. The boys he grew up with learned quickly. You didn't push Tommy. You didn't test Tommy. An insult got the same reaction as a threat. A joke at his expense got the same reaction as a knife in an alley. There was no middle gear. Worse, there was only off and all the way. Then at 15, Tommy was introduced to the man who would shape and ultimately fail to control the rest of his short life. Paul Vario, a Lucchese capo out of Brownsville, East New York. Vario was old school, heavy-set, quiet, the kind of man who never raised his voice because he didn't have to. His crew handled truck hijackings, loan sharking, gambling, cargo theft. Anything that moved through their territory paid a tax. He looked at Tommy and saw what everyone saw, a kid with no fear and no boundaries. Most men would have seen that as a warning. Vario saw it as raw material. Under Vario's wing, Tommy entered the orbit of a crew that would become the most famous in American crime history, though none of them knew it yet. He met Henry Hill, a skinny Irish-Italian kid a few years older, already earning, already trusted by Vario in ways Tommy envied. Henry was charming. He could talk to cops, businessmen, rival crews and make them all feel like he was on their side. Henry understood that life wasn't just muscle, it was relationships. It was knowing which doors to kick down and which ones to knock on politely. Tommy only knew one way through a door. They worked together. They stole together. They rode in the same cars while Paul Vario explained how the world worked. And Henry watched Tommy the way you watch a pit bull that someone hasn't chained properly, with fascination and the quiet understanding that sooner or later, something terrible was going to happen. Because even at 15, Tommy was different. Not different in the way tough kids are different, not just louder or meaner or more reckless, though he was all of those things. Different in a way that was harder to name. There was a blankness behind his eyes, as a stillness that had nothing to do with calm. Other kids got angry and you could see it building. The flush in the face, the clenched fists, the moment before the swing where you could still talk them down. Tommy didn't build. Tommy would be sitting at a table laughing, and then he'd be hitting someone, and the transition was so seamless that people watching couldn't identify when it had changed. There was no trigger. The violence just arrived, without announcement, without apology, and without any interest in whether you were ready for it. Henry Hill said it years later, after he'd left the life, after he'd testified, after he'd had decades to think about the men he'd known. He said violence didn't excite Tommy. It didn't frighten him. It didn't cost him anything. It was just what he did, the way other people breathe. And that was the thing nobody said out loud in 1965. When Tommy was 15 years old and Paul Vario was putting his arm around the kid's shoulders and telling him he had a future. Nobody said, this boy is going to get us all killed. Maybe they should have. But in the mafia, a kid who isn't afraid of anything looks like an asset. It takes years and bodies before anyone realizes he was always a liability. There's a moment in every monster story where the mask comes off for the first time. Not for the audience, for the people standing closest. In the ones who've been watching the signs, feeling the wrongness, telling themselves it's nothing. The first kill isn't usually the shocking part. The shocking part is how little it changes the person who did it. In 1968, Tommy DeSimone killed a man named Howard Goldstein. Tommy was 17 years old. Goldstein was a stranger, not a rival, not someone who owed money, not someone who'd crossed the wrong crew or said the wrong thing in the wrong bar. He was just a man who existed in the same city as Tommy on the same night, and that was enough. According to Henry Hill, there was no motive anyone could identify afterward. No debt, no insult, no order from Paul Vario or anyone above. Tommy saw a man, and Tommy killed him, and then Tommy went home. That's the detail that separates Tommy from the dozens of other violent men working Brooklyn in the late 1960s. They all carried guns. They all understood violence was a tool. You used it to collect debts, enforce territory, send messages that couldn't be misunderstood. Violence in their world had a grammar. It had rules. You hurt people for reasons, and the reasons made sense inside the logic of the business. Tommy didn't use that grammar. Tommy spoke a different language entirely. He killed Howard Goldstein the way a storm kills, not because there was a reason, but because there was nothing inside him that required one. As Henry Hill talked about this years later, after he'd left the life, after the trials, after the witness protection, after all of it. He talked about Tommy with the careful precision of a man describing something he'd spent decades trying to understand. And one of the things Henry said, one of the details that lodges in your brain and won't leave, was about how Hollywood got Tommy wrong. In Goodfellas, Joe Pesci played Tommy as a small man, 5'3", electric, a coiled spring of rage that could detonate at a sideways glance. Pesci was brilliant, but the physical reality was the opposite. The real Tommy stood over 6 feet tall, broad across the shoulders, built like a man who'd been lifting weights since he was old enough to close his fist. He didn't vibrate with energy the way Pesci's Tommy did. He didn't need to. Henry said the portrayal was 90 to 99% accurate in every other way. The temper, the hair-trigger pride, the way a room would go quiet when Tommy decided he didn't like something. All of that was real, but the size mattered, because it changed the nature of the terror. Pesci's Tommy was frightening because he was unpredictable, a small man who might do anything. The real Tommy was frightening because he was inevitable. When a man that large decides to hurt you, you don't run. You just wait for it to be over and hope you're still breathing when it is. By 1970, Tommy had graduated from errand boy to full-time earner in the Vario crew. His territory was JFK Airport, the rivers of cargo that flowed through it every day. Trucks loaded with electronics, clothing, liquor, cigarettes, jewelry, anything that could be stolen and resold. Tommy's job was straightforward: hijack the trucks, intimidate the drivers, move the goods to fences who'd sell them at a discount to buyers who knew not to ask questions. It was good money, steady money, the kind of money that, if you were smart, could build you a life. Tommy was good at it, reliable in the ways that mattered to Paul Vario. He showed up, he followed through, he didn't skim more than his share. Drivers who saw Tommy standing at the side of the road didn't argue. They handed over the keys and thanked whatever God they believed in that the big man with the dead eyes hadn't decided to make an example of them. But Tommy had a second talent, and it was the one that would bury him. When he couldn't stop making bodies. Not the kind the organization ordered, not the calculated removals that kept the machinery running and the money flowing. Tommy's bodies were different. They were personal. They were impulsive. They were the product of a man who carried a loaded gun the way other men carry a wallet. Always on him, always ready, always one bad moment away from use. And the bodies he was making weren't just random. They were connected. They had friends, families, affiliations. But every person Tommy killed existed inside a web of relationships that extended outward into other crews, other families, other men who kept ledgers and remembered names. Tommy didn't think about those webs. He didn't think about the ripples. He pulled the trigger and walked away and assumed that the world would rearrange itself around what he'd done, because it always had before. It wouldn't always. Somewhere in the back rooms of New York's 5 families, my men were already beginning to notice Tommy DeSimone. Not because he was earning, plenty of men earned. Not because he was violent, plenty of men were violent. They noticed him because his violence had no ceiling and no logic. And in an organization that survived on discipline, a man without a ceiling is a man with an expiration date. Tommy just didn't know his had already been stamped. You need to understand what the Sweet Lounge was before you can understand what happened inside it. And it was a nothing bar, low-ceilinged, wood-paneled, on a forgettable block in Queens where nobody who walked through the door was there by accident. The card games ran all night. Men in open-collared shirts leaned against the bar and talked in voices just low enough that you'd have to be standing next to them to hear, which was the point. The Sweet Lounge wasn't a place you went to be seen. It was a place you went to be among your own. On the night of June 11th, 1970, a man walked in who hadn't been there in 6 years. William Gambino, everyone called him Billy Bats. 49 years old, a made member of the Gambino crime family, just released from a 6-year federal stretch for narcotics trafficking. This was his welcome home. Friends bought him drinks. Men he hadn't seen since the trial shook his hand. For a few hours, Billy Bats was king of a small, smoky room. Tommy DeSimone was there that night. So was Henry Hill. So was Jimmy Burke. When Tommy was 20 years old, earning for Paul Vario for 5 years, with at least one murder behind him. He was respected the way dangerous young men are respected. Not for what they'd built, but for what they were capable of destroying. Billy Bats knew Tommy, not the man, the boy. Years earlier, before prison, Tommy had worked as a shoe-shine boy in the neighborhood. He'd knelt at the feet of men like Bats and polished their shoes for quarters. That's what Bats remembered. Not the 6-foot earner across the room, the child on his knees with a rag. And that night, in front of everyone, in front of the men Tommy had spent years trying to impress, in front of Jimmy and Henry and a room full of wise guys whose opinions were the only currency Tommy traded in, Billy Bats looked at Tommy DeSimone and said the words that would get him killed. "Go home and get your shine box." 5 words, said with a grin. More said the way a made man says anything to an associate, because he can. In La Cosa Nostra, a made man is protected by an oath that an associate hasn't taken, and that gap is a canyon no amount of muscle can bridge. Bats could say whatever he wanted. Tommy, by every rule of the world he'd chosen, was supposed to swallow it and walk away. Tommy didn't walk away. Henry Hill saw it first. Not the anger, everyone saw the anger. Henry saw the thing beneath it. the stillness. The moment where Tommy's eyes went flat and his breathing changed, and whatever lived behind his face dropped to something colder than rage. Henry grabbed Tommy by the arm and walked him out of the bar, got him onto the sidewalk, told him Bats was made, that touching him was a death sentence, that the rules existed for a reason. Tommy listened, or seemed to. He stood on the sidewalk and smoked and said the right things. And then he waited. They waited for hours, let the bar empty. Around 3 a.m, when the sweet lounge was nearly hollow, Tommy, Henry, and Jimmy walked back inside. What happened next took less than a minute. Tommy crossed the room and hit Billy Bats across the skull with the butt of a pistol. The sound was sharp and wet, bone cracking under steel. Bats went down. Jimmy moved in. They kicked him, stomped him. The blood came fast, pooling across the floor in a dark, spreading mirror. The few men still in the bar didn't move. They didn't speak. They understood what they were watching, and they understood with equal clarity that they had not seen it. They loaded Bats into the trunk of a car. He was unconscious but breathing, his chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged hitches. They drove north, out of Queens, out of the city, into the black rural silence near the Connecticut border. When they stopped and opened the trunk, Bats was still alive. His eyes were open. He may have tried to speak. Tommy finished it with a knife. Jimmy finished it with 4 bullets to the chest. They buried the body in a shallow grave. 6 months later, paranoid that the site could be discovered, they came back, dug him up, and buried him again somewhere else. 3 men killed Billy Bats that night. A Gambino-made man, murdered without permission, without authorization, without the knowledge of a single boss in either family. In the mafia, this is the one thing you cannot do. Not because murder is wrong, murder is business. But because a made man's life belongs to the organization, and taking it without permission is an insurrection. Tommy didn't think about any of that. Tommy was thinking about a shoe-shine box in a room full of men who'd heard him be called a boy. He thought he'd settled the score. He thought the blood on the floor and the body in the ground had restored something that Billy Bats had taken from him. He thought it was over. It wasn't. It was just beginning. Why? And the clock that started ticking in a shallow grave near the Connecticut border would take 9 years to reach 0. But it would reach 0. It always does. After Billy Bats, the smart play was simple. Any man with a survival instinct would have understood it without being told. Go quiet. Disappear into the routine of hijackings and collections. Stop being interesting. And let the weeks stack into months and the months into years until the memory of a Gambino-made man bleeding on a barroom floor faded into the background noise of a world where men disappeared all the time. The grave near the Connecticut border was fresh. The smart move was to let it settle. Tommy DeSimone did not make the smart move. Tommy DeSimone did what Tommy DeSimone always did. He made it worse. Late 1970, in a back room somewhere in Queens, one of those card games that ran from sundown to sunrise, where the cigarette smoke got so thick you could taste it, and the cash on the table was somebody's rent money. Tommy was there. So were several other Vario crew associates, playing, drinking, burning time, and pretending that the walls of this room were the edges of the world. A kid named Michael Gianco was fetching drinks. Everyone called him Spider. He was young, barely old enough to be in the room, and his job was the lowest rung of the lowest ladder. Bring the bottles, empty the ashtrays, keep your mouth shut. Spider wasn't a gangster. He was a kid auditioning for the part, and he hadn't learned yet that the audition could kill you. Tommy was drunk. That was the only context anyone could offer afterward. Not an explanation, just a fact. He was drunk, and he was bored. No, and at some point during the game, he pulled his pistol and shot Spider in the foot. Just like that. No argument, no insult, no provocation that anyone in the room could identify, then or later. Tommy pointed his gun under the table and fired, and Spider screamed and went down, and the men at the table looked at each other the way men look at each other when they have just watched something happen that they will never discuss outside this room. Tommy laughed. He thought it was funny. He thought shooting a kid in the foot was a punchline. Spider survived. The story given to doctors was the usual lie. A cleaning accident, a dropped weapon. Spider healed. He came back to work on crutches, his face carrying the expression of a young man who has learned something essential about the world he lives in. That pain can arrive for no reason, from the people you're trying to serve, and there is nothing you can do about it except keep showing up. And Spider did keep showing up. But something had changed. Maybe it was bravery. Maybe it was the specific stupidity young men confuse with courage. Whatever it was, a few weeks after the shooting, Spider said something to Tommy. The exact words vary depending on who tells the story. A mutter under his breath, a retort to an order. The details don't matter. What matters is that a kid on crutches found one small moment of defiance. Tommy shot him 3 times in the chest. Spider died on the barroom floor. He was there when the game started, and he was gone before it ended, and the men at the table had to step around the blood to cash out. Nobody called the police. Nobody called an ambulance. The body was disposed of. The floor was cleaned. The next card game happened on schedule. Henry Hill talked about this killing more than almost any other. Not because it was the most violent thing he witnessed, because it was the most revealing. Henry said watching Tommy kill Spider was the moment he understood what sat across the table from him every night. Not a tough guy, not even a killer in the way the rest of them were killers. Men who did terrible things because the business required it. Tommy was something else. He killed the way other people scratch an itch. The impulse arrived, he followed it, and the fact that a human being ceased to exist didn't register on any scale he carried inside him. Spider wasn't a threat. No, he wasn't a rival. He wasn't even a name that anyone in the Gambino or Lucchese families would have recognized. He was just a kid in the wrong room with the wrong man on the wrong night. And now he was gone, erased as completely as if he'd never walked through the door. 4 years later, in 1974, Tommy killed again. A Gambino associate named Ronald Giroth. Everyone called him Foxy. The motive has never been clearly established. Some accounts suggest a dispute over money. Others suggest there was no reason at all, which by now should surprise no one. What mattered wasn't why Tommy killed Foxy Girothi. What mattered was what Foxy was. Gambino connected. Another thread in the same web Billy Bats had belonged to. Another name added to a ledger maintained in rooms Tommy would never be invited into, by men whose patience was not infinite. Billy Bats, Spider, Foxy Girothi. 3 bodies. 2 of them Gambino connected. 1 of them a made man. And none of them, not a single one, ordered or approved by anyone above Tommy in the chain of command. Each killing was freelance. Each killing was impulsive. And each killing told the men keeping score the same thing. This man cannot be controlled. Tommy DeSimone was building a resume. He just didn't know anyone was reading it. Jimmy Burke was not like Tommy DeSimone. That's the thing you have to understand before any of this makes sense. They worked in the same crew, answered to the same capo, Nasha sat at the same tables, and operated inside the same machine. But they were built from entirely different material. Tommy was impulse. Jimmy was architecture. Tommy killed because something inside him misfired. Jimmy killed because he'd done the math, and the math said someone needed to stop breathing. The difference between them wasn't moral, it was mechanical. And on December 11th, 1978, that difference produced the most spectacular crime in American history, JFK Airport. 3 o'clock in the morning. The Lufthansa cargo terminal sat at the edge of the airfield like a vault someone had forgotten to guard properly. Inside, stacked in a high-security room, sat $5,875,000 in untraceable cash and another $875,000 in jewelry. Nearly $6 million, roughly $28 million today. The money had arrived on a flight from Frankfurt, West Germany, bound for the Federal Reserve. It never got there. 6 armed men in dark clothing walked through a side entrance at 3:12 a.m. They knew the shift schedule, which guards carried weapons, the alarm system, the door codes, the exact window between security patrols. They moved through the building like men who'd rehearsed every step. Because they had. Guards were subdued. The vault was opened. Cash and jewelry were loaded into a black Ford Econoline van. The entire operation took 64 minutes. Nobody was killed. The van disappeared into the Queen's night, and the largest cash robbery in American history was over before sunrise. The plan was Jimmy Burke's. Every detail, every contingency bore his fingerprints. He'd spent months assembling the operation, recruiting men he trusted, mapping the terminal, cultivating an inside man named Louis Werner, who provided security protocols. The heist was a masterpiece of criminal engineering, precise, disciplined, elegant in the way a perfectly executed robbery can be elegant. Tommy DeSimone was one of the 6 men who walked into that terminal. He was muscle, the kind of physical presence that kept terrified guards from doing anything heroic. Tommy didn't plan the job. He didn't need to understand the job. He just needed to stand in a room with a gun and make sure nobody moved, which was the one thing Tommy had always been good at. For one night, everything worked. The crew escaped clean. The money was divided, or it was supposed to be. Each man was promised roughly $750,000 for his part. That was the deal. That was what Jimmy Burke had promised. Jimmy Burke did not keep his promises. What happened in the weeks after the heist is one of the most chilling sequences in American crime, not because of its violence, but because of its patience. Jimmy didn't panic. He sat back and made a series of calculations as cold as the heist itself. The crew was a liability. Every man who'd been inside that terminal was a loose thread, a potential witness, a potential informant. The FBI, the NYPD, and every federal agency with jurisdiction were tearing the city apart. And Jimmy understood something most criminals don't. The people most likely to bring you down aren't your enemies. They're the ones who were standing next to you when you did it. So Jimmy started killing them. Not all at once, not in a frenzy, methodically. A man named Parnell Edwards, a Lufthansa cargo agent who'd helped the crew gain access, was found shot to death in his apartment. Martin Krugman, a bookmaker who'd connected Jimmy to the inside man, vanished. His body was never found. Robert McMahon, an associate who'd driven one of the getaway vehicles, was shot in the head. Teresa Ferrara, a woman connected to one of the crew members, was strangled and dumped. Joseph Manry and Robert Frenchie McMahon were found frozen in a refrigerated meat truck on a Brooklyn loading dock. Paolo Lacastri, a Sicilian associate, disappeared, one by one, name by name, body by body. By the summer of 1979, at least 7 people connected to the Lufthansa heist were dead or missing. Jimmy Burke was cleaning house with the same meticulous discipline he'd used to plan the robbery. He was erasing witnesses, consolidating the money, and eliminating anyone who might crack under federal pressure. The heist had been a work of genius. The aftermath was a work of butchery, and both bore the same signature. Jimmy's patience, Jimmy's logic, Jimmy's absolute refusal to let emotion interfere with what needed to be done. And here's the detail that matters for this story. In all that killing, in the systematic erasure of nearly every person who touched the Lufthansa job, Jimmy Burke never touched Tommy DeSimone. Not because Tommy was safe, not because Jimmy trusted him, not because Tommy's loyalty was above suspicion. Jimmy didn't kill Tommy for the same reason you don't bother swatting a fly that's already walking into a spider's web. Someone else had already claimed that job. The paperwork was filed. The decision was made. The Gambino family had been waiting 9 years for the debt on Billy Batts to come due, and the Lucchese family had finally run out of reasons to delay payment. For Tommy DeSimone had 5 weeks left to live. He didn't know it. He was still dreaming about the ceremony, the oath, the pricked finger, the burning saint card, the day he'd finally become untouchable. 5 weeks, and every one of them borrowed. This is where you have to slow down. Everything before this moved at the speed of violence, fast, sharp, one body slamming into the next. But this chapter is different. This one moves at the speed of a man getting dressed in the quiet of his own home, believing it is the best night of his life. January 14, 1979. The word came down through channels Tommy would never have been allowed to see. A message passed from one man to another, each layer peeling back one more degree of truth until what reached Tommy was a lie so clean it could have been gift-wrapped. The Lucchese family was going to make him. Tonight, Tommy was going to prick his finger, hold the burning image of a saint in his cupped hands, honor and swear an oath that would bind him to La Cosa Nostra for the rest of his life. Think about what that meant to Tommy, not the organizational implications. What it meant to a boy who'd grown up shining shoes for men who wouldn't look at him. To a teenager who'd watched his grandfather and uncle move through the world with the gravity of men who could not be touched, and who had wanted that gravity since before he understood what it cost. Was to a man who had spent 13 years from 15 to 28, earning, stealing, killing, and waiting for the men above him to finally say, "You are one of us." This was that moment, or so he believed. Tommy went to his wife, Angela. He asked to borrow $60. A man who'd participated in the largest cash robbery in American history 5 weeks earlier was borrowing $60 from his wife. The Lufthansa money should have made him rich, but Jimmy Burke had kept most of it. So Tommy asked Angela for $60 and told her he had somewhere important to be. She asked where. He didn't say. He got dressed. The good suit, dark, pressed, the polished shoes. He fixed his hair. He looked in the mirror. And whatever Tommy saw looking back at him, whatever version of himself he was carrying as he straightened his collar, it was the version that had made it. The version that was about to become untouchable. Of course, he didn't know that the men who'd sent the message had already decided he was dead. Tommy walked out of his house and climbed into a car with 2 men he'd known for years. They told him they were driving to the ceremony. The car pulled away from the curb and moved through the streets of Queens in the dark. And Tommy sat in the back seat and waited for the life he'd been building since he was 15 years old to finally begin. The drive wasn't long, Queens to Queens. A nondescript house in a residential neighborhood, the kind of forgettable building the mafia used precisely because no one would remember it. The car stopped. They walked to the door. Here is where the story holds its breath. Tommy walked through the door. And the first thing he would have noticed was the silence. A making ceremony is a gathering. There should be captains, underbosses, men in suits standing in a circle. The weight of ritual, voices, handshakes, the low hum of men who communicate in glances. The room was empty, not half empty, not running late. Empty. No captains, no saint cards, no men waiting to call Tommy brother. Just walls and floor and the kind of silence that has a texture. A silence you can feel pressing against your skin. And in that silence, Tommy understood. Maybe it took a full second. Maybe less. Maybe his brain tried to construct an innocent explanation. They're in another room. Way we're early, before the truth crashed through like a wall collapsing. Or maybe Tommy knew instantly. Maybe a man who'd spent his adult life around death could smell it the way animals can. Either way, the understanding arrived. And with it, the last feeling Tommy DeSimone ever had. The knowledge that the dream that had driven every day of his life was the instrument of his death. John Gotti was there. Not yet the boss he would become, but already the kind of man the Gambino family sent when they wanted something done without ambiguity. Some accounts place Tommy aggro in the room as well. The details of the next few seconds vary. 3 shots is the most common account. A silenced pistol. The head. Tommy DeSimone was 28 years old. His body has never been found. The mafia does not leave receipts. It does not leave graves for wives to visit. It takes you, and then it erases you. And the world moves on as if you were never there. Angela DeSimone reported her husband missing weeks later. The last time she saw him, he'd borrowed $60 and said he had somewhere important to be. That's the last confirmed detail of Tommy's life. Not a gunshot, not a betrayal. $60 and a wife who asked where he was going and didn't get an answer. Somewhere in Queens, there is a room where Tommy DeSimone's dream and Tommy DeSimone's life ended at exactly the same moment. Well, the floor has probably been replaced, the walls repainted. There is no plaque. There is nothing to suggest that a 28-year-old man walked through the door one January night believing he was about to become untouchable and instead became nothing. That's the room, and it's still empty. Now the story has to answer for itself. For 6 chapters, you've watched Tommy DeSimone kill and be killed. You know how the story ends, but you don't know why it ended only for Tommy. 3 men beat Billy Batts to death on June 11th, 1970. 3 men buried the body. 3 men lived with that secret for 9 years. And when the Gambino family came to collect, only one was handed over. So let's talk about Jimmy Burke. Because if Tommy DeSimone was the man the mafia couldn't afford to keep alive, Jimmy Burke was the man the mafia couldn't afford to lose. James Burke was born on July 5th, 1931. His parents were Irish-American, both of them, no Italian blood on either side. And in the American mafia, this was everything. La Cosa Nostra had one absolute requirement for full membership: pure Italian descent. No exceptions. No matter how much money you made or how many men you killed, if your blood wasn't Italian, you could never take the oath. You would always be an associate, useful, tolerated, profitable, but permanently outside the inner circle. Jimmy Burke spent his entire criminal career on the other side of that line. And paradoxically, it saved his life. Here's why. In the mafia's justice system, the punishment for killing a made man without authorization is death. Non-negotiable. But the enforcement protocol was built around the assumption that the offender was either a made man or eligible for membership. Jimmy wasn't. He existed in a gray zone the rules had never been written to address. The Gambinos could demand Tommy's execution because Tommy was Italian, could have been made, and fell within inter-family jurisdiction. Demanding Jimmy's head would have set a precedent that could unravel the entire structure. Neither family wanted that argument. That's the bureaucratic reason Jimmy walked. But there was a simpler reason, and it mattered more: money. Jimmy Burke was the single most profitable earner the Lucchese family had. His operations, truck hijackings at JFK, fencing networks, loan sharking, generated millions a year. He just masterminded the Lufthansa heist. Asking the Lucchese family to execute Jimmy was like asking a corporation to shut down its highest performing division because a junior employee committed a crime in the parking lot. The Lucchese family looked at Jimmy and saw a revenue stream. They looked at Tommy and saw a cost center. The decision was arithmetic. But here's what separated Jimmy from Tommy in a way that went beyond blood and money. Jimmy Burke was intelligent in a way that Tommy couldn't comprehend. Because Tommy's intelligence, such as it was, operated entirely in the present tense. Tommy reacted. Jimmy planned. Tommy swung at the insult in front of him. Jimmy calculated the consequences 3 moves ahead and chose the response that kept him alive. After Billy Bats, Tommy went back to being Tommy. Loud, violent, reckless, adding bodies like a man who didn't understand that each one was a vote against him in a trial he couldn't see. Jimmy did the opposite. After Bats, Jimmy went silent. He didn't talk about that night. He didn't boast. He didn't drop hints to men he wanted to impress. He folded the memory of Billy Bats into the same compartment where he kept every other piece of dangerous information, locked, filed, inaccessible, and went back to making money as if nothing had happened. And when the Gambino family started asking questions, years later, when the whispers had finally hardened into accusations, Jimmy let Tommy absorb the blame. He didn't frame Tommy. He didn't need to. Tommy had framed himself with every reckless killing, every public outburst, every act of undisciplined violence that reminded the 5 families why he was dangerous. All Jimmy had to do was step back and let the spotlight land where it was always going to land, on the loudest man in the room. The Lucchese family made their case to the Gambinos with Tommy's name at the top of the page. Tommy started it. Tommy swung first. Tommy was the one who couldn't be controlled. Jimmy was mentioned, certainly, but as a participant, not the instigator. And in the mafia's cost-benefit analysis, a participant who makes you millions is treated very differently from an instigator who costs you peace. Jimmy Burke was arrested in 1982. He convicted of the murder of Richard Eaton, a con man who'd swindled the wrong people, and charged with racketeering counts connected to the Lufthansa heist. He was sentenced to 20 years to life. He never got out. On April 13, 1996, James Burke died in his cell at Wenda Correctional Facility in Alden, New York. He was 64 years old. The cause of death was lung cancer. Natural causes, not a bullet, not a garrote, not an empty room in Queens. The mafia never touched Jimmy Burke. Not because they couldn't, because even after everything, even after Billy Bats, even after Lufthansa, even after a dozen other bodies, the organization still considered him more valuable than dangerous. And in the mafia, that distinction is the only one that matters. Look at the photograph again. The man standing slightly behind, half a step back from the center, not because he's less important, but because he knows exactly where to stand. His eyes are calm, his jaw is set. There's nothing on his face that you could point to and call emotion. He's already done the math. He's always already done the math. That's Jimmy Burke. And that's why he walked out of a story that buried everyone else in it. Henry Hill was nobody's first thought. That's not an insult. It's the reason he's alive in this chapter instead of dead in the last one. In a story full of men who demanded to be seen, Tommy with his fists, to Jimmy with his millions, Henry survived by being the man everyone forgot to worry about. That talent for strategic invisibility turned out to be worth more than all of Tommy's violence and Jimmy's money combined. He was born on June 11, 1943 in Brooklyn. Father Irish, mother Sicilian. Like Jimmy Burke, he could never be made. The oath required pure Italian blood. But unlike Jimmy, who compensated by becoming indispensable, Henry never reached that level. He was useful, competent-ish an earner, but never the man anyone built a plan around. Henry was logistics. Henry was cleanup. And cleanup is exactly what Henry did on the night Billy Batts died. Go back to June 11th, 1970, the sweet lounge. Tommy swung the pistol. Jimmy kicked and stomped. When it was time to load a bleeding, unconscious Gambino made man into a trunk, Henry helped carry him. When they drove north and opened the trunk to find Batts still breathing, it was Tommy who used the knife and Jimmy who used the gun. One, Henry's hands were dirty, but they were the least dirty hands in the car. In the Gambino family's accounting of blame, Henry was a footnote. He hadn't thrown the first punch or fired the fatal shots. He was the guy who held the door and mopped the floor. And in the mafia, footnotes don't get executed, not because the organization is merciful, but because killing a footnote spends political capital that could be used on something that matters. So Henry lived. Through the 1970s, and while Tommy stacked bodies and Jimmy built the Lufthansa heist, Henry continued earning at a middle level, running jobs for Paul Vario, staying in the current without making waves. He wasn't innocent. Drug trafficking, loan sharking, extortion. But none of his crimes drew Gambino attention. He wasn't killing made men. He wasn't embarrassing the organization. He wasn't loud. Then in 1980, Henry's quiet life got very noisy very fast. He was arrested on narcotics charges, serious ones, the kind that carried decades. Henry understood, with the clarity that only comes when a prison door is about to close, that the men he'd been loyal to for 20 years were not going to save him. Paul Vario wouldn't post bail. Jimmy Burke wouldn't hire a lawyer. Henry was on his own. So Henry did the one thing the mafia cannot survive. He talked. He became a federal informant. He sat across from FBI agents and told them everything. Names, dates, locations. Who killed whom, when, in and where the bodies were. He testified against Paul Vario, the capo who'd protected him since childhood. He testified against Jimmy Burke, the man he'd stolen with and killed with. His cooperation led to 50 convictions. 50. An entire ecosystem of organized crime dismantled by one man's decision to save himself. Henry entered the Federal Witness Protection Program and vanished. New name, new city, new life. When the mafia couldn't touch him, he was under the direct protection of the United States government. They could have killed him before he flipped. In the months between Henry's arrest and his decision to cooperate, there was a window. The organization knew he'd been picked up. They knew the charges were severe, but they didn't act because Henry Hill in 1980 still wasn't important enough to kill preemptively. By the time they realized what he was doing, it was too late. Once the testimony was on the record, the damage was done. Murdering a cooperating witness only brings more heat on an organization already under siege. So they let him live. And Henry Hill did something extraordinary with his borrowed time. He wasted it spectacularly. He was kicked out of witness protection in 1987. Pure Henry. He blew his cover by getting arrested again under his new identity. The marshals gave up. Henry was on his own again. No organization behind him. No government in front of him. Just a middle-aged man with a famous name and the most dangerous Rolodex in America. He spent the last 25 years of his life in the open. He wrote books. He did interviews. He cooked pasta on morning television and told sanitized murder stories to hosts who laughed in the right places. The mafia knew exactly where he was. Every family in New York could have found him with a phone call. They never came. Henry alive was an embarrassment, and Henry dead would have been a headline. The Mafia chose the embarrassment. Henry Hill died on June 12, 2012, one day after his 69th birthday. Heart disease. A hospital in West Hills, Los Angeles. The monitors beeped, and then they didn't. No silenced pistol. No empty room. Just a man in a hospital bed. Natural causes. Two words that Tommy DeSimone never got to hear. Look at the photograph one last time. The man at the edge of the frame, half visible, body angled toward the exit. One foot turning away while the other two stare straight ahead. He was never the center of anything, and that's exactly why he's the only one who walked out of this story still breathing. Henry Hill survived the Mafia the same way he survived everything else, by being the man nobody thought about until it was too late to stop him from leaving. Here's what most people get wrong about the Mafia. They think it runs on loyalty, on blood oaths and brotherhood and the ancient Sicilian code of honor. They think it survives because the men inside it believe in something, some shared ideal that binds them the way religion binds the faithful. It doesn't. The Mafia runs on math. It is not an empire of passion. It is a machine, very old, very efficient, very patient, that has survived for more than a century by doing one thing better than any other criminal organization: calculating the cost of keeping someone alive versus making them disappear. Every decision passes through that equation. The numbers don't care about friendship or loyalty or how many years you've served. They only care about one thing. Is this man an asset or a liability? Tommy DeSimone was a liability. He was violent without profit, a man who killed for ego in an organization that only sanctioned killing for business. He was a loaded gun with no safety, pointed wherever his mood happened to face. He killed Billy Batts, a Gambino-made man, over a shoeshine insult. He killed Spider because he was bored. He killed Foxy Girothi for reasons nobody could explain. Each body was a line item on a ledger Tommy didn't know existed, maintained by men he'd never meet. Every time Tommy killed, the men above him absorbed the political damage. They fielded the Gambino family's complaints. They made promises. They argued that Tommy was still useful, still controllable. And every time the argument got thinner. The Gambinos didn't forget Billy Batts. They didn't forget Foxy Girothi. By 1979, the tab had come due and the Lucchese family had run out of credit. The decision was arithmetic. Protect Tommy and risk a war with the Gambinos, a conflict that could shut down earning operations across the city and bring federal attention no one could survive. Or give Tommy up, lose one soldier, keep the machine running. The machine chose itself. It always does. Jimmy Burke survived because the equation said he should. Irish blood placed him outside the execution protocols. After Billy Batts, Ed Jimmy went silent, let Tommy absorb the spotlight, and went back to making money. And the money was the final variable. Jimmy was the Lucchese family's most profitable earner. The machine doesn't destroy the parts that are making it rich. Henry Hill survived because the equation said he didn't matter. His role in the Batts murder was minor. Cleanup, not violence. His status was low, a mid-level associate, not a man anyone built plans around. And when Henry finally did something that mattered, when he sat down with federal agents in 1980 and started naming names, killing him would have accomplished nothing. The testimony was already on the record. The damage was done. Henry alive was an embarrassment the organization could tolerate. Henry dead would have been a provocation it couldn't. 3 men committed the same sin on the same night in the same bar. One was chaos, one was profit, one was invisible. And the machine kept what it needed and removed what it couldn't afford. That's not justice. That's not revenge. That's the rules. And in the Mafia, the rules always win. But here's the thing about rules. They don't account for the people left standing in the kitchen after the car pulls away. Angela DeSimone reported her husband missing several weeks after January 14th, 1979. She went to the authorities, which, for the wife of a Lucchese associate, was an act that carried its own kind of courage or its own kind of desperation, depending on how you read it. She told investigators that the last time she'd seen Tommy, he'd asked to borrow $60. He said he had somewhere important to be. She asked where. He didn't say. He kissed her. Or maybe he didn't. We don't know. That detail has never been confirmed. It's the kind of small, a human thing that history doesn't bother to preserve. Whether a man kissed his wife goodbye on the night he was murdered, whether the last physical contact between Tommy DeSimone and the woman he'd married was an embrace or just a turned shoulder and the sound of the front door closing. What we know is that he walked out and he didn't come back. No body was returned. There was no funeral, no casket, no headstone, no grave for Angela to visit on Sundays with flowers or silence or whatever it is that women bring to the places where the men they loved are buried. The mafia didn't just kill Tommy DeSimone, it erased him. It removed every physical trace of his existence from the earth and left nothing behind. No proof of death, no confirmation, no closure. Just an absence where a man used to be. And Angela lived with that absence. Not for a week, not for a month, for the rest of her life. She lived in a world where her husband walked out the front door one January night and simply ceased to exist. No explanation, no body, no ending. Just the $60 he'd borrowed and the question he'd never answered. Where are you going? Somewhere important. The door closed. The car pulled away. The street went quiet. And Angela DeSimone stood in her kitchen in Queens and waited for her husband to come home. She's still waiting. I'll see you in the next one.